Hey everyone, welcome back to the 443 Security Simplified podcast. I'm your guest host this week. Corey needs a drink and a workout Nachreiner. And joining me today is...
Trevor Collins. Thanks for having me.
Of course, I'm happy you're here. With Mark out this week, I am both a guest host and Trevor is joining me. But with today's episode, we have more security news than we can handle, so we need to dive right in. It includes late-breaking Friday emergencies that down planes for at least an hour. And on top of that, we will demystify the 10 billion password RockYou 2024 leak, talk about a shady spyware product that suffered their own breach, and also update you on the SEC case against SolarWinds. With that, let's fly on in, assuming the planes are taking off again. I will start with a story about RockYou. Do you remember the RockYou breach, which I think, or leak, which literally happened, I think in 2009, Trevor? Was it that long ago?
Yep, a while ago. I actually do remember it a little bit.
Yeah. So if the listeners haven't heard, as you probably know, there's always various types of breaches that result in databases and records showing up on the underground. Usually they start being privately sold before they show to the public, but over time they sometimes get leaked. And back to really start the history of RockYou, back in 2019, some threat actor or gray hat on a forum leaked something that was literally called RockYou.txt. And this RockYou.txt was basically a file full of 14 million unique passwords. And over the past years, decade, that has grown. There's been additional RockYou releases, various files, and over time, it's aggregated to about 8.4 billion passwords. In any case, in the past few weeks, there has been a new update to RockYou called RockYou 2024, which has a new file. And of course, this release is grabbing a lot of headlines talking about the RockYou data leak, which it's grabbing headlines because apparently it's 10 billion records this time. However, I don't think this one is as big a deal as some think. Do you have any thoughts so far, Trevor?
Yeah, I mean, so this does remind me of a leak in the past, and every couple of years. And well, let me give you a little bit of background. I
Are you
do.
referring to Moab, by the way? But I know I'm cutting
So
you
the
off, but
leak I'm specifically referring to is actually the Clear Voice surveys, which
gotcha.
was about 3 years ago. It was released as this clear text password list.
Yep.
And then after reviewing it and after looking at it, we found out that it really was just a bunch of garbage. There was a few like passwords in it, but it was all the same passwords that's in RockYou. And so I actually have a little bit of experience in this
Oh,
because
for sure. You
doing
ran our dark web database for a long time.
for a bit, not anymore, but I in the past I was looking at a lot of breaches, and and every once in a while you would see somebody releasing a breach that had a whole bunch of passwords in it, claiming that it was a legitimate password release. Well, come to find out, a lot of times what they'll do is they'll download a download a breach, go through all the passwords, and then name it something else and just release it with just the passwords in itself.
Or
And
even act as an aggregator, right? I mean,
right,
if folks
or you
listening haven't heard, Moab stands for Mother of All Breaches, and it was another huge headline that came out because 26 billion records have been leaked, passwords and et cetera, et cetera. It turns out that was primarily an aggregate of a decade worth of other leaks over time, just someone repackaging it kind of in the way you say.
yep, between collections and breaches, it was always difficult to make sure that they were legitimate breaches and not somebody trying to get, you know, street cred on the, dark web forums and things like
Yeah.
that. So,
And it turns out you're right, by the way. The people viewing on YouTube can see that we're showing a reference from MyNet Watchman, who is another organization and person that actually follows breaches. They even put a de-hyping Reddit post on our cybersecurity. But Like us, like you did with our data breach database for a while, my Net Watchman actually has done a lot of breach analysis. And it turns out that this RockYou 2024 release is not that consequential, in my opinion. It does add about 1.5 billion records, as in passwords, to the previous 2021 file. But the vast majority of it is the same, starting with the first 14 million up to 8.4 billion in 2014. It's just a continuation of the things that have happened. One other thing with this breach or with this leak, in a lot of these database leaks, they actually have what's called credential pairs, meaning they will not only have a hash or a password, but they will have a username to go with it, or an email address that acts as the username. RockYou is very different in that it only has the password side and not always the clear text password. So by only having the password, it's a lot less valuable than having a full credential pair. Knowing a potential email address or username that might be associated with the password is much better. But anyways, according to my Net Watchman, only 1.5 billion things that are new. It is a mix of clear text passwords along with hashed or encrypted passwords. But there's also some just strings and word list records that are pretty inconsequential in the data set as well. According to my Net Watchman, they kind of say 84% of it is older than three or more years old. So it's not new passwords. This 10 billion grabs the headlines. You might think, oh, wow, 10 billion new passwords being leaked is a big deal. But most of these seem to be quite a bit old. And by the way, 10% of them are still kind of encrypted or hashed. I suspect, when a actual real password leak comes out, they are all typically hashed, but the short character ones tend to get cracked pretty quickly. And really, over years, people have probably been working on hashes and cracked ones up to, say, 12 or 14 characters. But I bet you the 10% of encrypted ones might just be very long passwords, so they
And
don't have much value.
and
Uh,
Corey, the add one thing to add to that, and just so our customers know, the RockYou word list was a very powerful list, and the reason it was so well known and well used is because you could use that password list with a couple of other rules and different programs that you could call, like a program called Hashcat, that anybody could really run within a day of trying to search on the internet with, and come up with about 70-90% of passwords from any breach. Now it's becoming a little bit harder nowadays, but that combination of the RockYou word list allowed a lot of breaches to be taken from the hashes and actually produce passwords out of that, to that then you could then proceed to a compromised account for if you were a hacker.
It's like you're reading my mind, Trevor, because I was about to ask you my first question, which is what, if anything, is the value of this RockYou leak? And I agree with you. That's it. Other breaches that have credential pairs might have higher value because you literally can go and try an existing credential pair and not only potentially gain access for that account directly in the site it was leaked for, but also see if that email address is associated with other accounts using the same password. So credential pairs are still way more valuable. But to your point, just exactly what Trevor said, if you're brute forcing, true brute forcing is trying random things. And by the time you get to trying random things, when you have really long passwords, it starts to take a real long time. So most brute forcing, applications like Hashcat and the many others really get value from having a word list that they can try these words before they actually truly start brute forcing character by character. And like you say, they have cool rules where they won't just try a word alone, but they can concatenate words together. They can add leet speak to it. And if you already have a list of known passwords, it's just it speeds up brute forcing and prevents you from literally having to do one at a time. So, I guess we both think this isn't the end of the world, The fact that there might be 1.5 billion new passwords might make a word list a little bit better. But is there anything else you think an organization or our customers or partners should do to protect themselves from this?
Well, I think there are a few things that we can certainly do in keeping your password safe. There's certainly things like multi-factor authentication that should absolutely be used for any corporate environment. And when you're creating a password, you should usually think of it as passphrase instead of just a password. So, um, instead of trying to figure out how many exclamation points and then numbers at the end of your, dog's name is the best way to do it. Think of it as
Or
like,
isn't the best way to do it, to
or
your
it's not.
add a
Yeah,
little
yeah, yeah.
sarcasm to it?
Yeah, so that's not the best way to do it. But think about what maybe some random part of your history, something that isn't your mother's maiden name or your dog's name, but
Could be a
you know
sentence or a longer phrase that actually is a combination of things together.
absolutely that. And don't you reuse your passwords, and then when you can use password manager as
Yeah,
well.
I might even skip directly to MFA and a password manager. I think you're absolutely right. You always should have MFA because if any credential leaks, even if you have a super, super strong password, there are ways credentials can leak through phishing or even kind of man in the middle or adversary in the middle attacks where, uh, they might actually phish it from something else or get malware on your computer that can pull it from memory. So you definitely need MFA to protect against leaked passwords. I agree with you. When you have to write the one password that you enter in, you should use a passphrase. And for me, I just use a sentence. I know that seems long, but a sentence with spaces and punctuation is usually long enough. Brute forcing won't get it. And it's relatively easy to remember. But the key thing is the real advice is your password should be as random and as long as possible and different everywhere. And I don't believe a human can do that. So, our main advice is besides your master password, you should be using a password manager with a master password. And I would just recommend using the generate password, set it to 24 to 32 characters in length, press generate. It will give you this crazy password that you're never going to remember, but you don't need to because the password manager remembers it for you. Cool. So,
Good
in any
advice.
case, interesting to see RockYou folks continuing to update their password word list, but you shouldn't consider this as dangerous as like a credential pair leak, and it is really a lot of old information. Moving on to our next story, it actually involves SolarWinds. I'm not sure if you remember the SolarWinds breach, but let me give a quick update, or not update summary for our audience, although I'm sure they remember when we covered it long ago. SolarWinds is, of course, a very popular company that makes IT services. One of their biggest products is called Orion, which is a network and IT monitoring solution. So it helps you monitor network stuff. In any case, quite a while ago, that company, their company was breached, and attackers got so much access that they got access to build servers and source codes. And during that time, during a long period of time, they lived in SolarWinds network. They adjusted the source code and build process to actually add a Trojan to the installer package of this very popular Orion package. Of course, this was before SolarWinds knew about it, so this legitimate Orion installer went out to many customers, including many Fortune 500s, installed malware on their computer, a Trojan that allowed the attacker to then get into many other big networks, and it was quite a big deal. A good example of a digital supply chain attack. Now, more recently, in October 2023, the Securities and Exchange Commission, or SEC, actually charged SolarWinds and their CISO, their Chief Information Security Officer, Tim Brown, for fraud and internal control failures relating to these known cybersecurity risks and vulnerability. At a high level, the complaint basically alleged that between October 2018 through December 2020, which was during the time SolarWinds was doing their initial public offering to go on the stock market, that long story short, this sunburst, this attack, this breach happened, and SolarWinds did not or failed to disclose this as a known risk as part of its filings with the SEC to go public. So this, of course, could mislead investors into investing in this particular company. Anyways, this is critical information that you really need to give to your investors to give them the information they need to know if they're going to invest in your company. However, the one question is, during this entire public offering, did SolarWinds know? So the news story, which I'll pull up real quick right now, let me get it up for our audience, is actually a judge has thrown out a large chunk of these SEC charges against SolarWinds. So kind of good news for SolarWinds. Basically, on July 18th, a judge dismissed a major portion of this, saying basically that SolarWinds and the CISO Brown cannot be held liable for statements and filings made after the breach of the company. So one of the things that the SEC was using for evidence are both internal and external statements that basically allude to security wasn't perfect at the company. But these were all things after SolarWinds learned about the breach, not before. However, on the other hand, the judge did say they can proceed with charges for any misrepresentation the company made about their cybersecurity posture leading up to the attack. So, in short, if companies, I kind of think this is a good thing, Trevor, because when a company does learn about a breach, it's one thing you would like to see them do is transparently disclose that to authorities, to the public, and even to the cybersecurity community, to kind of share details about what happened, mostly to help help inform the community on how to avoid this. And if companies are held liable for information they share after a security incident, that would probably kind of disincent or curtail customers from wanting to transparently disclose things. We'll talk about what the judge says the SEC can continue to do, though. But what do you think about this ruling so far, Trevor?
Yeah, I like the ruling for the most part. I do have some caveats about that, and I think that it in when it comes to the security in principle is that it is much better to be transparent on your security, and the only way to allow that to happen is by allowing people to make mistakes in security. So if everybody gets punished into or fined into oblivion, then nobody is going to be transparent about it. But however, there was a little bit of shenanigans, it seemed like, to be going on with some of the higher ups in the SolarWinds business, where they were selling shares, things like that were happening. There's more like financial side of it, um, but it seems like maybe it wasn't really, either they didn't have enough information or it wasn't big enough for them to really care about in the whole scheme of things. What
Yeah,
they what the judge seemed to be really caring about is misrepresentations that were happening before the incident that was causing problems.
exactly. And that gets to the point of SolarWinds actually is not off the hook completely. The judge did also say that the SEC can proceed with any charges about about the actual cybersecurity claims the company made before the breach. So, for instance, if the company kind of posed as having great security while they were doing the public offering, while there were internal things where they were saying differently, the SEC can still charge them for that. So I do think, besides potential, when people were selling off shares shenanigans, I do know the CSO was known for kind of publicly talking about how SolarWinds had good security, but internally the CISO did know that they weren't meeting all of NIST requirements or made statements about being behind on patches. So it is an interesting case. Also, I'm a CISO myself, although I guess I'm called a CSO here at WatchGuard, but I'm under the gun in some cases if WatchGuard ever did anything negligent in this way. Do you think this helps CISOs or puts them more under the gun?
I I think, like I was mentioning earlier, I think it does help the CISOs because it allows us to be more transparent, and we're not trying to hide our security. Um, this isn't. I haven't worked for a publicly traded company in the security sense as a security position. Um, but what seems to be what was happening in uh, SolarWinds was that they were claiming that they were having a program. This is kind of what a lot of what I have seen people are thinking is that they claim to have something set up, some type of completely organized security setting, and it was just like in the beginning planning stages.
Or
So
like they were doing a framework or a standard like NIST, but they weren't complete on the maturity model. They were just actually starting it.
correct. It was on a piece of paper, but nothing was actually being done about it. So I think, but back to your question, I think that this does help us. I think it does help the CISOs, and it helps to uh, us to be a little bit more transparent, so we're not worried about somebody
I do
coming to
too,
get
and
us.
and frankly, I actually so far don't think CISOs are too far under the gun as long as they're good CISOs. I want to make sure there's no laws that put CISOs unfairly under the gun, but there have been negligent. Like I won't. Maybe you were being kind because of who we and I am at WatchGuard. We really do try our best to be good for security, but the Uber CISO, there have been CISOs that have literally hid breaches when they knew about the breach and paid hackers to not disclose it while they were actively hiding it. So I think the difference is between we want to protect CISOs that are trying to do their job well and in an ethical fashion. But we don't necessarily need to protect CISOs that are actually lying and trying to hide attacks unethically. So I think the good part of this is one, I do want to be able to transparently share details without being damaged financially as a company about any sort of incident, vulnerability, things that happen to a product to my customers in the world in order to protect them. Like if I have a vulnerability and I'm investigating an incident, I think it's very worthwhile for the customers to have all the details on how to protect themselves and to make sure they know if they're affected by any sort of incident that happens. So I really believe in as far as we can, sometimes authorities don't let you share everything, but I would like to share some of that detail to help the entire cybersecurity community and tech community learn from it. The other thing I'd like to protect is internally, CISOs also have to be able to talk frankly about security without thinking it's going to pop up in a court case. You know what I mean? Like if no matter how good you are at security, you're going to find things you want to fix, nonconformities, risks. And part of our job as CISOs and our office, which you're part of, Trevor, you help run our SOC, is to not only point those out and make sure the right leaders know about them, but to try to push towards those getting fixed. If certain things are brought up in court, even though we're ISO 2701 compliant as a company here at WatchGuard, that doesn't mean there's not perfect security everywhere. We find things we want to fix all the time. So if the fact that I'm talking about my good ISO certification, but internally I found a risk and that shows up in court and somehow makes us negligent, I don't think that's fair. I think CISOs can't have their hands tied and they need to be able to talk about security risks. On the flip side, though, if there's a misrepresentation, if there's negligence, if there's lying about a state of security, when investors are actually really, kind of banking on knowing you're doing well as a cybersecurity company, that is pure negligence. So I kind of feel like the judge properly thread the needle and made sure good CISOs in the future can disclose things while also making sure that negligence is still something that can be prosecuted. So good. Maybe I won't be going to jail next year, Trevor.
Oh, damn. No, not just kidding.
Yeah, you and Mark are disappointed. He had become one of you would become CISO, and the other one would become a director. So let's jump into the MSP spyware, or I'm sorry, MSpy spyware breach. I'm not sure if you heard about this, but let me share. Around July 11th, the world got news through not MSpy, the company I'm going to talk about in a second, but from other people that there was a big data leak that seemed to show that a popular spyware application called MSpy, that company had been hacked and some information had leaked on the underground. For our listeners, MSpy is not like a ubiquitous software. So MSpy is a spyware application that markets itself as legitimate. It's like a legitimate tool for a parent, a spouse, or a partner, or a workplace to keep track of someone's device and what people are doing on that device. So, like if you're a child, you can put it on a traditional computer, but MSpy is mostly for mobile phones, and you can keep track of their geolocation. You can see who they're calling, what they're texting, gather files and pictures from the phone. So it's technically spyware, in my opinion. I'd love to know your opinion, but it's something that's actually marketing as a legitimate product for parents to put on children's phone, and for spouses to put on each other's phone. Now, before we dive into what you think, do you know making spyware and selling spyware is not illegal, but installing any snooping software on someone else's device without them knowing it is illegal. So, first of all, what do you think about this legal spyware, or this
Well,
semi-legal spyware, Trevor?
there are programs that come out that are legitimate programs, that like Cobalt Strike, um, and that will also be used for malware breaches. There's also illegitimate programs that could be used in the proper in a proper way to be used legitimately. Um, I think for the most part, MSpy is illegitimate. I think that their intentions are to kind of release this grayware software. Um, and also, when you start looking at who they are and their record, you can see that this is now the third time they've been breached, and they don't seem to be very
Yeah,
up and
let's
up
jump
as
into
far as
that.
legitimate.
I agree with you. While they kind of pose as a legitimate company, I think the secret thing is they're assuming parents are installing this on children's software, more particularly stalkers and upset spouses worried about cheating. They're installing this without the person knowing. This software is made to hide. It's not made to know, for the victim that you've installed it on their device to know it's there. And if it were legitimate and legal, the person that had it would have to know. So think about workplaces. Workplaces, it's probably legitimate that if someone gives you a work computer, they can monitor that you're doing work on it. That probably is legal. But the key thing is you're going to know your workplace is monitoring you. In this case, it's meant to hide on the phone. So to me, that makes it kind of, at the very least, unethical. But one of the things that came out, you mentioned two things. I didn't know about all three breaches, but one, uh, we now know the name of the company. It was, before, the name of the company that makes this was not easy to find, but MSpy is made by a Ukrainian company called BrainStack. And you're right that they've had breaches before. The first one was in 2018. But getting back to this new one, let's talk about this new one. As I mentioned, it came to light mostly because data showed up on undergrounds, or even organizations like Krebs and Have I Been Pwned started finding it. And the data that showed up, the other thing to say is BrainStack have not commented on this at all. They have not disclosed it themselves. They also have not publicly acknowledged any of the stories or the breaches. But in this particular breach, we don't know how the attacker got access to BrainStack and MSpy's information, but they seem to have gained access to the Zendesk system, a very common support system that a lot of companies use to provide technical support. And in that particular system, the BrainStack or MSpy has service records dating back from 2014. So over or right around a decade. 24 million unique emails were in the data leak, according to Bright and Krebs. Others found 100 gigabytes of data. Now, this isn't all the company's data, but if you think about what would show up in a support system, there is personally identifiable information like PII, so names, email addresses, IP addresses associated with the devices that MSpy is basically spying on. And that sort of information, even images of credit cards when some of these customers were trying to pay, somehow there were images of credit cards in the system. But there's also some other interesting information. Like if you think of all the things this spies on, I don't know how they would show up in support cases, but there were personal documents from the devices being spied on. And most concerningly, there were some nude or inappropriate pictures, selfies. And that's one of the things that concerns me about this type of spyware is one partner might have access to a bunch of private pictures on someone else's phone. So this is the type of data that leaked. What do you think attackers can do with that type of data, by the way? What's the risk there?
Well, the immediate risk would be blackmail. If they say, we've all gotten those emails that say, oh, we installed a virus on your computer and we've seen what you've done in your private time. And, well,
Sextortion.
this, that,
Yeah.
sextortion.
Sextortion
Yeah. And
emails.
then they never actually have anything, obviously. But
In some
with
cases,
this
like in most
information,
cases, they don't, but sometimes they have. Yeah,
yeah, and the 0.001% of them. But in this
exactly.
case here, they actually will have something, and they could basically say we're going to release this unless extortion, and so that's certainly a one possibility. Now I think there might have been text messages in this breach. To be honest, they're all there. So the 2015 breach and 2018 breach and this breach all kind of got
Yeah.
pushed into one that gets confused. But like there might have been text messages on there, and like you said,
I
screenshots.
think for this one, like the software is definitely capable of recording text messages and more. But I do think in the past breach, it was actually the database data for the cloud app that holds some of this. In this one, since it's the support case data, it's not like every text message stored in the cloud. You know what I mean? They're getting the data, but it's kind of on a case by case. Like I don't think I don't think the attackers, at least from what we can see from the leaked information, have gotten the cloud source of all the data each individual MSpy user might have in the cloud that's being spied on. But that data sometimes is showing up in support cases. So it's kind of hit or miss. If you opened a support case with MSpy and the person that got the spyware installed on their partner might be asking a question about why the text message thing isn't working, there might be examples of some of the text messages in that support case. But unlike the 2018 breach, I don't know if they literally got every piece of information possible that this, but nonetheless, as you can tell from the 100 gigabytes, there's still plenty of sensitive data in that support information, including those nude selfies. So
And
the
I
same
think
point, I don't think every image that MSpy has is giving to the partner that's spying on them is in this breach, but I think somehow some of them got into the support data. By the way, that's one thing that kind of concerns me about this company, right? Like I would assume the data, the picture data, that if you bought a company to spy on your partner, you want access to the picture data, but you don't want that floating around at the employees of the company that have it. So I'm curious, were these nude images the specific question in the support case? Or could it just be a support? Like, think about the support rev that has access to this information, might just be looking at some of the data there while they're supporting it. So it is somewhat unclear how much of it's there. I'm glad you went straight to extortion because that was my worry. Obviously, some of the stories out there are talking about the PII leak. You know, things like email address and IP address can be used for in the same way as other personally identifiable information. to help with further social engineering and to potentially help with identity theft, although I don't think there's enough data here to really do identity theft. But my worry was just like yours. When there's nude images, like why not go straight to that customer? The other way I think you can extort it is, remember, the real victim here is the person whose phone is being spied on. Do they even know their workplace, their wife, some nation state agency, a parent is spying on them? Someone can literally go to the spyer, whether there's nude information or not, and say, I know you're spying on your spouse. If you don't do something, I'm going to tell them. So there's a lot of privacy implications for sure. The one other thing I want to talk about, Trevor, is in the story, it was also found out that various government agencies and authorities seem to have played with MSpy. And this is me putting on my speculation opinion hat, but I do not like these type of programs and think they should be illegal. But one of my feelings is the authorities actually are looking for ways to sometimes spy on people under the guise of catching criminals. And they sometimes seem to support these applications. Do you have any thoughts about that?
No, I did. When I was first reading about this and seeing how, okay, this is the third time that MSpy was breached, I'm like, why does the FBI have to make the Anom phones, which were some phones that the FBI made a few years ago where they didn't create them, but they facilitated them to allow criminal organizations to use them, and then the FBI could basically read all that information while the criminals were thinking that they were hiding it. Well, why does the FBI have to do that if the MSpy is already there doing it for them? You
Exactly.
know,
Yeah.
but yeah, it's something that you're not going to want to get involved with, and usually when there's a little bit of a shady business happening, shady things will happen, and breaches
Yeah.
like this, I feel like
I do
best
say,
to
like you
avoid.
say, if it's shady, they're probably not making their own security a top priority either. So at the very least, can you even trust them with this data? So that was going to be the weekend news, Trevor. But unfortunately, the day we're recording this, for the listeners out there, it's going to be Friday, the week before. But we had kind of big news today that was an emergency that affected global businesses around the world. So, long story short, there's many headlines talking about Microsoft and or CrowdStrike outages. Some of the headlines I saw even said Microsoft outages caused by CrowdStrike. Now, let me actually describe these stories. By the time you listen to this, you've probably seen the news because this is making headlines everywhere. Airlines had to ground planes for a long time, and there's been a lot of delays because airlines were affected by one of these outages. But the truth is, there's actually a couple outages that really created the perfect storm of confusion. I will talk about the CrowdStrike one, which is the biggest one. But one of the things that happened late October 18th and late July 18th and early today, July 19th, was Microsoft Azure and M365 had some partial outages. Azure went down for at least, I think it was around 3 hours, at least in central USA regions. And while this was happening, around the world at different locations, there were also many, many Windows computers suffering a blue screen of death. I'm sure all the nerds around the world know that that means it's basically a Windows OS crash, that your machine crashes. Hopefully, if you restart it, it will get better. Those are two different incidents, though. The blue screen of death, as it turns out, was a product from a company called CrowdStrike. The product is called Falcon Strike. It's essentially kind of enterprise endpoint protection and EDR, endpoint detection and response software, similar to some of the software protection, the endpoint protection products we make here at WatchGuard. CrowdStrike, for companies that were using it only on Windows computers, it did not affect their Mac and Linux versions. There was an update. And as listeners know, endpoint software actually has very strong, deep ties into operating systems. In order for it to do its job, it often has to have kernel level drivers. in order to monitor legitimate Windows processes too, because living off the land attacks nowadays target very legitimate Windows processes. It often has lots of hooks and memory injection detection techniques. And if it makes a mistake, it can crash an OS. And in short, CrowdStrike released what they call a single content update, which sounds to me more like it's a detection and like a signature, but detections update, which may include some additional files, but may not be a full product update. But a single content update that had a bug in it, a mistake that had to do with one of their new memory detection techniques that caused Windows to crash, to blue screen of death. And unfortunately, it was a crash loop that, unless you went into safe mode and did a lot of steps to fix this, you could not reboot the computer. So while Azure was having outages, other companies were having blue screens of death. And if you think about endpoint software, we not only install these on all our computers, we install them on all our servers. And if you're a flight, an airline, you might install them on the kiosks. On the airports, might install them on the computers running the monitors, talking about schedule updates. So many companies had huge outages where they basically all their computers went out and they had to figure out what was going on. And it turned out to be this CrowdStrike update. And I also think a lot of people run virtual machines in Azure as part of their infrastructure. And I think part of why the Microsoft Azure outages might be mixed with this is if you're using CrowdStrike to protect any of your organization's private Azure installs or virtual machines, they would be affected too. So let's pause there. What do you think about this? Or do you have any other additional information about this story?
Yeah, as the news was coming out, it definitely seemed like they were related. But if you take a look at it, there's about half an hour, just less than half an hour difference between where the end of the Azure was finally confirmed as recovered to the point where the CrowdStrike file, because of the file name that was involved, you can kind of tell what time that started. It was just a half an hour difference, less than half
Yeah.
an hour difference between that. And
And the other
so,
thing to point out, by the way, Microsoft has confirmed they're not related. For the actual Azure outage, they basically said, they have cluster management. I'm sure you know clusters. They're probably using containerized clusters of machines that they spin up and down to support their Azure infrastructure. And they said they made a configuration change to their cluster management that caused access to the central US region to be cut off. So Microsoft has claimed responsibility in a configuration change to their backend to cause the Azure thing. So it's very clear the Azure thing was not related. I will say the CrowdStrike issue is a kind of a bigger deal in that, one, it affected a lot of big companies, but more importantly, Azure outages are a big deal. Everyone uses Azure and everyone uses M365. But the good thing about a public cloud outage that's, say, that cloud provider's fault is when you go down, you can't access it. It goes down, you can't access it. So that's an issue. But they will bring it back up. And when it comes back up, you don't have to do anything. Things will start working again right on their own. In this CrowdStrike issue, it was nothing to do with the cloud. It was the sensor update on individual computers. And more importantly, it would put you in this blue screen of death loop, which to fix, CrowdStrike couldn't fix it alone. They released, of course, an update and instructions to fix it, but you literally have to go to each of these endpoint devices, put them into a safe mode or a Windows recovery mode, and do some steps before you can get the computer back into a state where you can get the update that fixes the problem. In fact, Mark, I forgot to mention, or in the intro, I mentioned how I'm guest hosting this week. Mark is literally traveling home, and I won't name his airline in question, but his airline was having blue screens of death all over their kiosks. And he even caught a picture of a service person going to individual, kiosks and to recover them. One other way to recover them too is use I think they used BitLocker and other stuff. Anyways, go ahead,
was
Trevor.
that Mark's picture, or was that off the internet?
It might have been off the internet too. I do know Mark sent pictures of his gate, though. A blue
I
screen
did
of
see
death
that
at his
one.
gate.
Yeah, that was interesting to watch. But yeah, I as far as the CloudStrike issue, that you could kind of read between the lines on some of this here, and I'm kind of making some guesses, educated guesses on this here, but you could tell they wanted you to connect to the Ethernet so that you could actually get to the internet faster, because it seemed, and so you could summarize that the program had some type of loop that would eventually crash if it didn't connect and update fast enough. So as opposed to going on Wi-Fi, it would take longer to connect, give it more time for that program to run and crash. um, and then yeah, the recommendation of going to safe mode keeps the program from running, things like that. There was
It was
obviously something in
specifically,
there.
there's a little bit of detail. I'm not sure if you've seen it, but CrowdStrike finally updated their own. The CEO has been making news media podcasts. I've been doing news today, which is why I'm more dressed up. But they released a update on their site, which said specifically it was in a portion, it was in a new detection that had to do with memory detection techniques, but it would cause the CPU to go to 100%. So whatever the issue is, the way it was conflicting with the operating system, to your point, the issue mainly was it would quickly make the CPU go to 100%. So, like you say, booting into safe mode so that it couldn't load some of the CrowdStrike drivers, including the part of the update that caused these CPUs to go to 100%, is how you would prevent it from happening long enough that you could remove a particular file and fix the issue. You can find all this information on CrowdStrike's site on the thing. Was a big deal today. I will say, by the way, when this outage was happening, people were wondering, is it Azure? Is it Microsoft? Is it a cyber attack? Is WatchGuard affected? We're not at all affected by this. This was, remember the Microsoft Azure outage, different situation. Microsoft's configuration change messed it up, but that's been fixed for quite a long time now, and all is good. This CrowdStrike issue is only going to affect you if you're using CrowdStrike Falcon Point, and then it will affect you. But WatchGuard products are obviously not an issue in that case. Obviously, we have a lot of partners and customers out there that use lots of things. So if you were affected by either the Microsoft outage or the CrowdStrike issue, our heart goes out to you. Uh, let's talk about, what do you think CrowdStrike should do about this in the future?
I, for CrowdStrike, uh, what they would want to do is, it's quality control is obviously going to be an issue moving forward with this. There are some things they can do for further testing. It's I would have I would think that they have a robust testing environment, tested on different Windows
Regression
computers before they
testing, things
release
like
it, some
that.
regression
Yeah.
testing. Um, Somehow that failed. So you talk about doing some type of, not a security incident response, but an incident response on the engineering level, to try and figure out exactly what process in the testing failed to identify the 100% CPU issue, and and also on the customer safe facing side moving forward. um, you want to make sure that you are reaching out to the customers and telling them, hey, we need to go through official channels and make sure you contact us directly. Don't let anybody, and so far they've done a very good job at this. Um, but make one thing that as I was reading this, was that people are going to try and take advantage of this. Be like, oh, hey, did you get this blue screen of death? And while you're on using CrowdStrike Falcon, you're going to need our assistance here. We're here to help. And well, it's actually, they're not there to help. They're just there to
So
cause
you
more
mean kind of like
problems.
when the fake Microsoft support calls or Apple support calls, where they're like, there's malware on your computer, but really it's social engineering based on a known incident that's happening.
Exactly.
Cool.
Precisely. And CrowdStrike has asked on their blog statement that you only contact their support and contact them through official
Yeah.
channels. So I think they have done well on that
Typically,
side.
what they'll say is, we don't call you, you should call us. So, like, if it, a general tip for that type of vishing or phishing, if someone calls you saying their support from any company, you should say, okay, whatever, I'm going to call back your real number to see if this is true.
right, including if there's a website that go to CrowdStrike, the real CrowdStrike. We promise we won't
Yeah,
lie to you.
some
You
weird
know,
domain.
don't go to, make sure you're on the official website.
Yeah. So I agree with you with the quality assurance. I know that CrowdStrike probably has QA. I do think over time we might be learning more specifically about what was updated. This is diving more in the weeds than I did today in public interviews, but I'm not sure if the update was just a client. Like there's two types of updates with endpoint security software. There could be a complete sensor or client update, like a revision to the client that basically is a reinstall of the software. But these clients also get protection updates regularly. Like a full revision to the software probably only happens once a quarter, point revisions maybe once a month. But things like detection signatures, new detection rules or patterns, even other things might be updated on a more regular basis. Uh, CrowdStrike keeps on calling this a single content update, which I don't really, I think that's their term for something. It's not a common term, but the fact that single content is in it makes me think it wasn't a sensor update, but it was maybe just some sort of detection update, the kind of update that you get very regularly rather than the kind of update you get with a regular install. And the point I'm getting at is I agree with you that you need mature QA or quality assurance processes for both. There should be a lot of focus on a big client update. And one of the things I'm proud of at WatchGuard for our endpoint software is we kind of have a unique way of rolling out endpoint updates. First of all, we do plenty of normal QA regression testing and internal testing before it ever touches anyone else outside our organization. But one thing with endpoints, which end up on millions and millions of devices, is you can't perfectly recreate every weird environment your endpoint's going to be in. So you can only recreate so many tests. But we also have a very phased beta process. We have a very deep and phased beta process, which even includes a period of time which we call friends and family. So before we're even rolling it out to real customers, we roll it out internally to ourselves, to our sales engineers, to friends of the family that we've shared software with, or special partners who've asked to be part of our friends and family beta. So even after our own internal QA test, that gives it an opportunity to get a more limited beta for the client updates. And then the other thing we do is if you think about like hardware updates, usually companies will put up a firmware, and when it's ready, it's given to everyone and you can go and download and get it. And that could be the case with endpoint software. But even when we start to roll this out to GA, we do it in a phased approach. Customers don't all get it at a time. After the friends and family beta, it goes out to portions of customers at a time. And this is to continue to watch it and make sure there's no things we've missed to minimize any impact of a unknown bug. So long story short, I mean, every software company will have bugs. This is no matter how good you are, I don't think we should fault a company for having bugs. But to your point, we need to continue to learn from the bugs we have and improve our QA processes to catch those bugs. The only other thing is the updates that the security software gets on a more regular basis to detections and signatures. That QA process is kind of a different one, and you need to make sure to mature it. So I assume CrowdStrike is going to go look at the specific bug that they had. They're going to figure out why their existing regression test didn't catch it, and they'll probably update their tests to find a way to catch that type of thing in the future. So was a bad day for CrowdStrike. I'm sorry for any customers that were affected because I'm sure you had to touch all of your computers. But going forward, CrowdStrike and other security companies can learn from this and get better. Well, it has been a busy week, Trevor.
Absolutely.
Okay, everyone. Thanks again for listening. As always, if you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. If you have any questions on today's topics or suggestions for future recordings, be sure to reach out to us on Instagram. We're at WatchGuard_technologies. Thanks again for listening, and you will most likely hear from us next week.